for a second round of discussion about Walter Benjamin and David Graeber. And it was especially because I met Lisa Wintersteiger, and then I heard Nicholas Smaligo speaking of Graeber, Benjamin, and Agamben about sovereignty in Lyon conference. And I was very keen to put them together and discuss, and to discuss more on depth what we started discussing about Benjamin's violence, critique of violence, and its relationships with Graeber's theory. A short synthesis of what we already said in the first meeting. Graeber makes reference to Benjamin's critique of violence to say there is that between state violence and democracy is an impossible marriage. They can't be together. The only way they can be together is through make-believe that makes the people a unique being, but the people as a unique being can only exist through a fiction that makes the people of the United States represented against a culprit or as a fiction that is the basis for violence. And this is also the theme of Benjamin's critique of violence. He says a legal system can only be legitimated by an act of violence that is outside the state, outside the legal system. So at the end of the day, even the legal system is based on violence, just as the pure violence of the kratos, of the dominion of the strongest. If you refuse violence, you have to both refuse the state and the force of the strongest. So, and also in our last discussion about this text of Benjamin's, we had difficulties in interpreting the last part of the text that about mythical violence and how to get out of this conundrum. So yes, if I can give you the floor, I don't know if Nicholas or Lisa prefer to be the first.
I feel, Nicholas, you just gave a paper. It's all fresh up there. Mine's a bit cronky and old. I had to like flick through what I was thinking a few years ago. But
that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm like, what did I think a few months ago? Because I had to put this stuff aside. But I am still very interested in it. So I can try to just say, I mean, I considered the paper that I gave in Lyon, I consider it a first draft of some questions that I think are important. I really agree with you, Simona, that I think the problem that Benjamin is articulating is something that Graeber is wrestling with. And Benjamin's like references to Benjamin are scattered throughout a lot of his work, but I also think that there's a lot of places where he's wrestling with the problem that he's not, directly citing it, and we don't get a full kind of exegesis of what he thinks about this. It's just kind of, he's putting it on the table. But I can say just what I was trying, what I'm trying to think about in that essay and how it relates to to this problem that Benjamin articulates in the Critique of Violence, namely the dialectic between law making and law preserving violence, and and the way that those two things are kind of mixed together within the police. But so this is a starting point for Agamben too, right? For Agamben, this essay, where not only you have the problem of sovereign power, and this, which he will translate in terms of, you know, the problem between constituting and constituted violence, right? The lawmaking violence is always extra legal. And it establishes a new order, and as soon as it does, as soon as it constitutes a new order, then it needs to preserve itself by attacking any extra legal violence that might constitute some new order, right? And so for Agamben, this is really central to the question of revolutionary politics. And this is, he thinks, the problem that all revolutionary experiments of the 20th century were shipwrecked upon, you know. And so he's trying to figure out how, so he turns toward an archaeology of the nature of sovereign power in order to try to unravel what he thinks of are other kind of like deep secrets of sovereign power by examining the Western tradition of political theory and ontology. And ultimately he thinks, right, we're gonna have to create a new kind of ontology in order to get out of this problem. And I don't know really what I ultimately think about that. But what I was trying to point to, what I think is very interesting, is that Graeber's also concerned with this problem, concerned with very similar political aims, right? What would it mean to create a revolution that would not simply reconstitute a new state and repeat that problem? But he's not interested just in kind of myopically understanding the history of sovereignty in the West. In fact, what he's trying to do, I think, is take a very different approach to unraveling this problematic by understanding sovereign power as a distinct form of power from administrative power. And those are categories that Benjamin also uses toward the end of the essay. And that part of the problematic of modernity is that we're imagining these things as bound up, and this is part of this dialectical tension that we have. And so if we want to try to open up our sense of political possibilities, then we're going to have to disentangle those things and understand them in themselves. And so I read Graeber and Solons's work in On Kings as this attempt to understand the nature of sovereign power in its essence, kind of prior to its contingent historical association with an administrative extension of that power. And so Graeber is going to take this concept of sovereignty and its intrinsically paradoxical formation that he agrees with Agamben and Schmidt on in some way, that the exercise of sovereign power is always the ability to step outside of the existing moral or legal order and through acts of violence, and that's always this ambiguous thing. On the one hand, it can appear criminal. On the other hand, it can appear divine. and it always has that dynamic to it, even apart from the problematic of the relation with the police and the administrative extension of it that we find in modernity. And I think that philosophically, that's just like a fascinating move. And it's the kind of thing, I'll just say like why David Graeber's thought is so important to me, and what I think is going on is I read Graeber as basically trying to find, to re-ask these fundamental questions of political philosophy that have always, within the Enlightenment tradition, have always like implicitly relied upon a projected anthropology, but that anthropology has just been empirically ridiculous. And so what I see him trying to do is actually to like maintain against various forms of postmodern currents, both what is correct about those critiques of like the attempts to pose and ask universal questions, but basically to pursue the attempt to ask universal questions about the human experience, just to say we've been doing it wrong because we're not actually grounded in a broad empirical understanding of the ethnographic record. And that also involves, of course, a relationship with what we don't know. That when we're asking universal political questions from within any given social society, our imagination is limited. We can only realistically extend that imagination through an encounter with ethnography, and that is only also a tiny slice of the reality of the human experience. But it can help us to make better generalizations about what our possibilities are. So the question of sovereign power for Agamben becomes a question of, the original relationship of, homo sacer within the Roman legal tradition. But for Graeber, it becomes a question about the nature of kingship across the world. And so he's trying to invite us into reflecting on all of the variety of different ways in which sovereignty has been expressed, but which also did not necessarily become, the basis for what you can kind of get in Agamben, this kind of like teleological course set of this fate of the history of the West, or something that was just working itself out toward the death camps. For Graeber in On Kings, and also this, I think, comes up in The Dawn of Everything too. It's kind of central to their argument about breaking apart the state conceptually. You have these different ways in which sovereign power was limited in time and space, and that there's certain ways and reasons why forming royal families and kingships is itself like a desirable thing that people do. It's not entirely just domination over an extended territory. He's saying that essentially that's a much later development. And so in order to understand the essence of sovereignty, we have to look at it. We have to both understand what's been desirable about it and look at the ways that it has been contained by another positive force within a given political situation, namely what he calls this kind of constitutive war between the sovereign and the people as this kind of fundamental form of politics in relation to sovereignty. So the ways in which the people, the subjects, contained their king. And this is his analysis of sacred kingship, which is always in this battle, this strategic battle and game with divine kingship, the principle of sovereign violence, the embodiment of divinity in the form of a king, is always being attacked by the people's attempts to hem the king in with ritual restrictions so that sovereign power can't really be exercised. I know I'm drifting pretty far away from Benjamin here, but I'm just laying this out in part because I'm still trying to figure this out, and I want, especially for people that are reading a lot of Graeber's work, to know what you think about it, because then I think, but to bring it back, what we're getting in Benjamin's analysis of the relation between lawmaking and law preserving violence then looks very different, because it looks not as an intrinsic nature of politics or sovereign power, but an attempt to analyze the particular historical conjuncture of the relation between sovereign and administrative power that have been bound up in modernity and justified with reference to, as Simona was saying, this abstraction called the people. And I think there's one part, this is what you were getting to at the end there, Simona, or talking about the confusion at the end, which is, it's confusing for me what Benjamin means by divine violence too. But the way that I'm currently trying to think about it in relation to Graeber is, you know, there's these kind of basic metaphysical categories that I think Graeber is developing around play, games, and freedom. And that's kind of maybe a longer argument, but he associates the principle of pure play with sovereign power. That what you know, play is actually something that's very dangerous. You know, it's acting without rules. It's acting, you know, in an immediate, like, you know, the end in itself kind of activity. And he thinks that this is, you know, a feature of, you know, human existence. And there's a way in which what sovereign power is the kind of the arrogation unto one person or one small group of people, that principle of play, you know, in connection also with these acts of violence that then establish a new set of rules. And so in the concept of sovereignty, you have that power arrogated to some people, which might be criminals, might be divine. But then what I see, or what I think is kind of very interesting to connect it up with the theory of free peoples within the dawn of everything, is what I see Graeber and Wengrow is trying to do, is to ask, what does it look like, or what are the conditions for sustaining that relationship of play outside of the dynamic of sovereign power, so that it's not just you know, one group of people, a hereditary lineage, a king, a robber baron, whomever, who has that power to step outside of the existing social order and reconstitute its rules, but that what free peoples is the care for that capacity to be collectivized, so that this concept, so that sovereignty, and maybe it's no longer sovereignty, right? But it's just what a free relationship with any given political form is. But it's like, in sovereignty, that's been condensed into the hands of a few, but that there are and have been human societies that have maintained that capacity of a free relationship with their politics, the ability to both make promises and commit to certain sets of rules and to break them and change them, that are outside of this particular dynamic of sovereignty. And that might be a way to understand what Benjamin is talking about with divine violence, this capacity for collective disruption that is not simply the reconstitution of a new order, but is the holding open of the possibility for transforming the orders. I realize I just gave like a dissertation there, but that's like a whole bunch of things that are swarming around in my head around these different texts. And I'd love to hear what people think about it. And I hope it was clear.
It was amazing. Only I'll need 1 month or two to digest all of it and to answer. But yeah, thank you so much for this. Lisa, may I give you the floor?
Sure, thank you, Simona. Thanks so much, Nicholas. Where should I start? I mean, I guess, so I'd like a little bit just like to just be in dialogue with some of your thoughts there. And again, it's been a while since I looked at Agamben's work, but I think it's really clear from this text, from the critique, where Agamben gets, you know, some of these absolutely critical starting points for so much of his, you know, subsequent work, whether it's mere life becoming bare life, and I think the point I'll revisit later because I think it's so crucial to the question of myth and mythic violence, or whether it be, states of exception based on the idea of, the emergency becoming the rule. These are all really crucial Benjaminian ideas, and I often read the two together. I'm going to try and kind of leave, like, maybe let's say leave the sovereign problem like a little bit floating there, partly because I haven't been involved in your conversations on David Graeber's work, and I feel like it's a real blank spot. So I feel like I can't read across, but certainly for Benjamin, I don't think this text gives us some conditionalities, I think, for the problems around decision, but I think maybe some of his work in the Trauerspiel might be more useful there, because that's where he really begins to, or ostensibly uses his thinking around Schmidt. But so I thought I would just sketch some like very quick immediate responses, having reread after very many years. So I suppose two things just to introduce kind of my interest in Benjamin's work. I focus on him as a legal philosopher and also legal practitioner. Always very difficult to do law on Benjamin. It's one of his maybe most contentious areas of writing. And then also I was deeply interested in his beginning suggestive writing around the education. So I've written on specifically the problems around law, guilt, and myth in relation to Benjamin in my doctoral work, and then also moving on to education to try and think through that problem with his writing on Kafka, because I think that's where you start to get something further. So I don't know how many Benjaminians in the room, but I think it's important to say that the text was a part of a triad. So he was writing on 3 other essays, 2 were lost, and I think, we can but wonder. I mean, the one I think is called Life in Violence, and the other missing was Teleology Without End. So like they feel like critical parts of this thinking. And look as as an exposition of those really basic, and in a sense they may even seem a little bit banal, lawmaking, law preserving, right? Like it's got to start from somewhere, right? So we've got this historical instituting force, and then we've got this preserving force, and in fact deeply unstable dialectic, which is the problem he starts with Weimar being so unstable. That's where he was really working from that problem. Some of his clear lines of like out, and I think they're difficult, but they make enormous sense to me as a legal scholar. The first he really starts to try and divulge is the very important distinction between strike and general strike. The minute the law gifts rights, right, within that system, already the compromise is made, which is why he talks about extortion. So certainly the historical problem of rights giving falls under that problem, instituting force, and then you preserve it. So demand for workers to take on some, to have some rights is already a betrayal, right? Because you've lost that kind of the much more potent revolutionary drive for complete change, because that's only the condition is strictly in general strike. So that's really important. I think for today's politics, we see it in England, we see it elsewhere. What's the problem for conditionality of strike in particular industries over particular, specifics and a collective exercise? And it's fundamental to the system, right? And it's little understood, and I think it always bears revisiting. And he would say it's that root and branch problem. General strike attacks the legal system root and branch, the form of law. Specific, rights to strike don't do that, and in fact reinforce the problem. So Simona, I was going to say, quickly again rethinking on, and I'm going to suggest maybe that's some links to David's work, just because I know little bits. But so the problem where he begins to talk about fate, right? It's really important to understand some of the sort of the linguistics of this, I think, because of course he was writing in German. So first of all, for him, Gewalt in the German is both force and violence, and that's a big, otherwise to the English reader, this often seems very difficult to take on board, right? then with fate, there's a really interesting philosophy and semantic of that understanding, which is to do with order as well. Of course, the ordering of the cosmos, and specifically to do with apportionment, right? One's lot, equally linked to the word, to the idea of debt. And the indebtedness is a question of either debt or guilt, right? And for him, that ordering is the fundamentals of how kind of prehistoric societies understood the ordering of the cosmos and the extent to which life and debt were indebted to one another. The idea of Moira, by the way, as a construction of power, was one in which the gods were equally subject to, right? So he talks about boundaries, but let's be clear, it is a fact of the ordering of the universe, fate, right? Neither the gods nor mortals can overcome that. But the boundary question is the really important one. And I think the two lovely stories, which I think are the best insight, at least for me, are where he contrasts the core and Niobe. So of course, Niobe, she, you know, boasts about her 9 children and her son to Leto, and in consequence brings down the wrath of the gods for her arrogance, and she is turned to stone, and her children are slaughtered by Artemis and Apollo. So remains guilty, ossified, you know, in this place, but a very clear indicator that the gods do exist, they're manifest, and they help distinguish how this ordering happens, this continual re-establishment of the order of fate, right? So that's a clear kind of moment for him where we can say this is the problem of fateful ordering. It is cyclical, and it is fundamentally ambiguous. You didn't break a law, but yet you're struck down. So he rereads that back into the kind of secular problem of law, which is that, you know, ignorance is no defense, and that is continues to be a truism. We are, you know, we could very easily, any of us, become guilty. And the key thing is we're already guilty, and it's only at the point at which the law has to place its force on you that the question of then determining innocence or whether you get away from it or not is applied. So you have no out. And the no out problem is the problem of fate. There is no way of reorganizing the relationship in a different way, of an ethical, you know, agreement, or you know, the other things he mentions where he talks about conference or diplomacy, all things that are the ones that allied the problems of contractual violence or just legal violence per se. And in the Levite example, and it's one of the most difficult, and I won't pretend to be, you know, to have that kind of sophistication, but the critical difference in the story is, in that story, they were struck down and swallowed. So it comes from the book of Numbers, right? So although there was an offense, the point is that the Levites were swallowed in the ground and stayed alive into their graves, as the story goes. Bloodless for Benjamin. In Niobe's case, the children were slaughtered. So he's trying to find a way where this kind of Richtschnur, this force of, yes, educative force that gives people some kind of guideline, but can never be the framework against which the judgment is applied. That's what he's trying to get at. These are the kind of models he's trying to work through. And I think he does that work really, really well with Kafka later on, where he talks about, you know, the students without script and how, you know, how can we rethink that problem? So it's not a total deposition of law, but he tries to depose law in every frame in which it can be connected with lawmaking or law-preserving violence, which for him is an abomination. And the worst abomination, of course, is that it attempts to tie itself to a notion of justice, which for him is only divine, can only be divine, and is not one that we have ready access to. Right? We can't. It's not in our keep. So I guess I'll leave it there as my sort of at least beginnings of sharing some of the bits of the story that he tries to put together, that I think, like as ever with Benjamin, he ain't gonna program for us. We've got to work it all out on our own. But I do still think his work on language and communication and the problem of like really interesting, like why is it that the conference and so on are the only examples in which law, at least historically, was not engaged, because it didn't sanction lying. First problem of all societies, I guess, is like, how do we agree when I don't know if I can trust you and if you're telling me the truth without a violent intervention? I mean, it's fascinating. No, we have this problem all the time, and it's one we perhaps don't give enough thought to. But yeah, I'll just leave that there.
Yeah, that's, well, still I'll need one more month to digest all of this too. But thank you very much for this. It's really mind-blowing. One thing I must say, that when I read in The Dawn of Everything, the freedom to disobey, I was, it was strong for me, because I come from the tradition of political philosophy and of sovereignty, where the main moral compulsion is there's a rule, if it's shared, if it's given through in the right way, through consensus, if we all if it's a good law we agreed on, pacta sunt servanda, we have to obey, and disobedience is a difficult thing for, in my frame of what's just. And it also has to do with if people are free to disobey, how can we cooperate? How can we trust that it's a problem of trust, of course, that we agreed to do this difficult enterprise together, and you'll not be a free rider on this enterprise. You will not profit of what we do together without giving your part. And this has to do, I think, in some way that I have difficulties to explore with the right to lie. Lie and disobedience are somewhat related. And yes, just how to think an ethics and a politics that is okay with lying and disobeying is an important thing for me. Through Graeber, I get that the right to disobey is essential for consensus and for and if you refuse violence and coercion, you also have to refuse enforcement, and not having an enforcement means you have the right to disobey. Nonetheless, it's still a difficult point for me. So I'd like to get your take and others' take about it.
I was just going to quickly say something. The way I can't speak enough for Graeber's work, but for Benjamin, he comes about it backwards now. His problem is that there's nothing expiatory. There's nothing expiatory. There is no way out of the guilt, and it's completely totalizing the way that the law function as he understands it in terms of lawmaking and law preservation. So, and by virtue of that, and that's why he says it's the same register of fate, because it is everything. All things are captured there, and in that capture, there's no room for the problem, the ethics, the difficulty, the taking of that responsibility and having to so I think his answer would be, that's exactly that's the task, because we've been giving it over to law and sovereign decision making for so long, and it's not, perhaps we'd argue, not getting us where we want to be. So then it throws back in precisely that difficulty on us. So it's the right difficulty, it would seem to me, and certainly Benjamin would say so.
Stephen, are you?
Yes, I'm here. Hi. I had to step away from a minute. So did I miss something?
Oh no, I just thought you were about to ask for the floor, but if I may was mistaken, it's okay. No, I said that my greatest difficulty with the dawn is this idea of the freedom to disobey, and because it simply blows up everything I believe about the state and ordered living together and taking decisions and applying them together. And Lisa answered, or maybe Lisa can answer again, that for Benjamin, at least, it's all about the fact that all things are captured into the lawmaking, law preservation frame, and there's no way out of it. There's no way to, no freedom to make promises, because you are captured in this frame. And yes, I think it's actually all about the freedom to make promises and of negotiation. There's something I loved very much in this Benjamin's text, and something that I just understood through Graeber is the idea of pure means, that is negotiation, that is consensus making, without the threat of violence. And yeah, I think this is a key to understand this conundrum of the freedom of disobey. You cannot make promises if you are not free to disobey, and you cannot change the agreements and the relationships of even of power if you are not free to disobey. Anyone has comments or questions, or nobody?
I've just got a bit of a question. Thank you, everyone, for talking. Like what you said, I really enjoyed what you both said. But in the text, Walter Benjamin talks about unalloyed means are never those of direct solutions, but always those of indirect solutions. And I couldn't figure out what unalloyed means.
Pure would be the
Pure.
simplest.
Okay. Just pure, yeah, okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said, Lisa, in answer to Max's question.
I was going to say unalloyed, for me at least, my sort of the most steady translation through the text is pure
Okay.
means.
Thanks.
which again means without ends and pure means. This is work that Agamben takes twice to think through later on, very much so. So how do you purify, exactly, how do you engage in an exercise of pure means, removing those ends, which doesn't fall back into this deployment of particularly the positive law framing, right? What are the other sources we can conceive of?
I just want to say, I don't feel entirely clear about how to interpret much of that, and there's maybe people that I could read that would help me with it, but well, I think Simona, I'm hearing you kind of give an interpretation of what pure means is. I mean, in terms of consensus and the freedom to disobey being kind of contained within that. And I don't know. I mean, but one thing that I would just want to say about that, and like the way that I'm reading, the importance of the freedom to disobey, is, first of all, that relies, that's not like a right that would be granted by the state. And I think when we're talking about those three elementary freedoms, we're in some way talking about like a meta-political context in which that allows for a free relationship with any constituted order that would have to be sustained by actual material conditions outside of it, customary, and so that it seems like what Graeber and Wengrow are arguing, right, is that like baseline communism, or a fully developed or a very robust principle of baseline communism would serve as the kind of concrete practices that could sustain a freedom to disobey, because then nobody would fall into such a position where they would become coercively or have to accept coercive relationships, and so could have a free relationship with agreements, hierarchy, or whatever that was separated from those relations of domination. And I think all of that relates with this question of pure means in a certain way. But I also feel like it kind of feels to me like Benjamin is working with, he's working with these terms within the long philosophical tradition, right? The relationship of means and ends and things like that. But he's also trying to like think them so hard that they break out of their normal meanings. And what at least my kind of guiding hypothesis in the relationship here between Graeber and Benjamin is that in some ways, like, Graeber's trying to get at some of the same things, but saying we actually need a different set of categories to talk about it. And then we can get at these relationships, but it's a little clearer what we're talking about. That's what I hope is the case. I can't actually argue that right now, but that's like my interpretive hypothesis here. And I could say more, but that's all I got right now. Really enjoying this. Thank you all.
I was gonna just say, I mean, he's like the great excavator, isn't he, Benjamin? I mean, so this idea of a negative messianism is, the structural practice, right? Of course, there's lots of kind of Kabbalistic thinking there, and his work with Gershom Scholem is probably some of the finest to think that, and I think really, really beautiful work and well worth reading. But this kind of excavatory idea that you go back and you collect the shells. No, but this is like a deeply Jewish. So you collect what, rather than this utopian forward. Here we have all these, it works backwards, no, but it works backwards from the present, and that's where, I mean, I think this text, again, it's not the only one, but he shakes time always, doesn't he? His ideas of teleology are so fundamentally different, nothing mechanistic. So we start from the now because it's what we have, this is what we see, but then there's the journey of an excavation, and we, what are the treasures we pull, and how do we re-juxtapose those things to give us some, you know, mechanisms to develop a different ordering? And that's not just a reformist ordering, right? That's a fundamental break, which again is that, you know, the revolution in the world, right? Not in, you know, not kind of salvationary progress, but in the world has to happen, right? And so that's, I think, that's the practice. And I guess certainly Agamben picks that, and Arendt take from those ideas, don't they, and then re-excavate those terms. And I think there's always riches for us in doing that. No, but I wanted to, can I throw a question up to the group, particularly Nicholas and others, and Nika actually, which kind of to take some of this thinking, but into a very, so let's take the Benjaminian practice of what the present, you know, the present. And I was wondering about our challenge of, for example, Occupy, this approach to assemblies, and it's been a discussion very lively now. It's going, we're seeing, you know, global, more local examples of, you know, this, maybe this conference. How do we have a different form of a dialogue that could look something like at least an aspect of the governance process, right? And the difficulty I think that this text presents with those processes, the assemblies, is I think where they're increasingly sophisticated is giving, you know, a fair representation of people and their ability to represent themselves up to a point, no, chosen by a politician and so on. The problem becomes when they form a decision. So you have your sovereign minute, right? Your sovereign moment. We decide, whoever we, or the people in that instance maybe. Well, then the problem. So in that, I would try not to be. I'll channel Benjamin for a minute, but I would assume that structure and that process would be considered non-violent in his thinking. The constituting moment, though, when the decision is made, what the people decide in that, then you have your problem of implementation, and we've been seeing it in the slightly boring ways of, well, we make a decision and the state doesn't agree, whatever. But actually, I think the problem is more about of law, because the minute you have a decision made and you revert to, you know, your legal system, preserving, making, you back in that diabolical, fateful problem. And I just wondered, I don't know if Nicholas or others have been thought anything around this text, around law, and like, so if we made decisions differently, like how do we implement, how do we think through that process?
Maybe I jump in. Maybe it's a question also, what kind of decision we're making, because on this assemblies, people are making decisions that they can implement right now between themselves. They didn't make a decision that the government should issue this or that law. I think it's specifically Extinction Rebellion who formed this concept of citizens' assemblies that's supposed to give a government, make a decision for the government how to combat the climate change. Because climate change is something that's considered to be correctly much bigger outside of our individual or group reach. So basically we need some big force to do something about that. Otherwise it may kill us all. So, but originally, specifically in Occupy, the idea was that, you know, it's like what David was saying, that the revolution happens when people change their common understanding, common sense on certain points. So, but I still will stick to David's ideas compared to Extinction Rebellion, as we saw when we talk about that. For the last number of years, Extinction Rebellion was very extensively, heroically, and effectively petitioned the government and tried to convey them, like, you know, the obvious things that they have to do, but it didn't lead nowhere. So we're still in a situation when the government, given all governments in the world, give huge amount of money to the fossil fuel industries and practically do nothing about climate change. So I think maybe we should try another approach and see how it goes. You know, what if we will really try to change public imaginary in a big scale, and assembly is a good thing for that because it's playful, and it's doesn't require or actuates against coercive power. So something like that.
I have a direct question to Nika about that, if that's okay. What happens when people turn up to the assembly but they demand? I'm not talking about expertise. Expertise is something else. But if you are in the situation where you are only familiar with referring to an authority to define the legitimacy of something, then you've skipped the step of, for example, the point of being able to trust in your own ability, just what I was rambling about in the chat, your own ability to evaluate expertise and make a decision and think about what someone else is saying, rather than thinking about this imaginary third party that is going to authenticate. I know an assembly works against that, but if you come to an assembly with that, then the assembly is not going to deliver its promise. So in that sense, that's why I'm always fascinated by art and storytellings, because those are interventions that can impact adult human beings before they've been processed in the sausage factory, and awaken them to be ready to participate in an assembly. So that's all I wanted to add there. It's my daily grind with students, is exactly this problem.
Was it a question to Nika or?
It was a kind of just comment to Nika, just
Okay.
to, yeah.
So Nika, do you wish to tell something about?
No, I think I agree. Maybe I saw Stephen just started to edit our brain trust document. I think we can try to implement the same or work towards this practically make a practical work based on these theoretical ideas about the task is to change public imaginary as to versus put in the law that everybody have to obey. And this brain trust was a project that David ran for the last year of his life. That was independent think tank he created with many other people on the request of Extinction Rebellion, exactly for putting together a positive program how to combat climate change. So that will be one of the big, major, most important project of hopefully of David Graeber Institute. We have a paper where we're discussing that, so everybody welcome to join and contribute.
I saw a hand raised by Max Lawson. No? May I?
It was a clap for Adi. Take over.
May I make some comments, or is anybody who didn't speak willing to take the floor? Nick?
I'd say something about Occupy and assemblies, I think, because I mean, that was for me a very formative moment, and also like a lot of the political currents that I've been a part of since then have been in some ways like born out of the frustration with assemblies and the attempt to do direct democracy. And like one of the analyses or critiques that came out of it was that essentially the way that this was taken up at a certain point, but pretty regularly, was that people were, as Avi's saying, kind of orienting themselves toward a consensus-based assembly as if it was supposed to be a new government. as if it was supposed to, and it was a failure that it didn't have that sovereign apparatus of enforcement or administrative apparatus of enforcement, you know, and that this is, I mean, I don't think that that's the spirit that it was kind of coming out from, but then, but it also felt to people that was what was needed, you know, to be able to make decisions together on that scale. And like part of the analysis that I mean, this was like Crime Think's critique of Occupy, and also in the Invisible Committee and others, where they were like, you know, essentially that attempts to turn to transform an assembly from a space of encounter between, you know, people or groups that have their own kind of paths and singular orientations into this new constituting force. What it tended to do was, you know, you'd spend 6 hours coming up with a decision that was actually just the lowest common denominator that nobody felt passionately about enough to actually commit to. You know, you felt passionate about the participation in the assembly, but the decision was gone, you know. And personally, I don't think that is a, you know, devastating critique of the possibility of consensus assemblies, but it does pose this question of like, what are these things for, or what context do these make sense within? And I think, you know, especially if you are in a context where, well, just to take another political example, you know, the ZAD in France, you know, which was, you know, for a decade and, you know, still in its own way, a really fascinating experiment. But it seems to me from my reading of it that at a certain point, they were like, we actually need an assembly because we have to figure out how to live together on this land, and people are, you know, projects are overlapping, we're having all this conflict. We need a space created for us to coordinate. And then, you know, within a certain angle on that, a certain kind of very pure anarchist perspective, it was like, well, we're creating a government now, we're creating a state. And then there's a whole crazy mess of things that happened in the fallout of that. But I think that essentially there's a fundamental question of political theory here that's being raised in terms of the question of like, how would we do, how would we build forms of decision making that don't rely upon that moment of sovereignty. And I actually I don't think I have an answer to that. I don't think that anyone has an answer to that. And I think partly the non-answer of it is part of the approach, is that actually we're like, maybe the idea is that we have to like give up on the notion of the perfection and of that there is going to be a single form. Like maybe the process of a free politics is the process of moving through these experiments, and maybe that's all it has ever been. And the encounter with one another and the failures and the disobeying and the lying, you know, it's like what we're trying to do, and all we can ever do is try to make promises together, try to hold ourselves to those things. But once we try to make that next step into like solidifying it into something where it's like, now, you know, if you don't, we're going to lock you up or we're going to kill you. Like maybe that's actually the threshold we don't want to cross.
Exactly. Can I quickly comment?
Please.
I think we should just talk also about what is decision allowed to make and what is not allowed to make, and what is the nature of decisions we are taking. And it's really in Extinction Rebellion, when the people discuss how to participate in action together that could be dangerous, you know, then it should be a consensus, and the people must be able to step out, you know, because not everybody wants to get arrested and go to prison, for example, or glue themselves to some object or some bridges. But so I think that's very like important decisions that could be only made in that way. But the other decision, for example, in Museum of Care, we had a big conflict in the beginning when it just started. So a museum, as you know, we can have as many reading groups or whatever else project we have. It's basically a website. You just set up another page and do yourself something. But it was a group of people who created a room that was about setting up the rules. It was the room about setting up the rules for everybody else. And these particular people, they didn't do their own rooms, you know, like, but they wanted to have an assembly in which they will design the rules, and like other people in the other rooms will follow, you know. So how funny is that? This is like actually like, you know, from the textbooks. So basically like make an assembly and participate in what you personally are gonna do with the bunch of people that you convinced to do, and you know, and then don't like, yeah, don't make rules for others. Then you don't need coercion or violence at all. And it's a question, of course, Lisa probably like with Extinction Rebellion is a really big deal, because we need to make a decision for everyone, for every humans, you know, because somebody is drowning in Pakistan because we here use a lot of electricity, you know, or whatever we use. So we're all interdependent. So that's the biggest question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, writing at the time, maybe Benjamin was writing, what would he have had to say about the challenges of this kind of dialogical decision-making processes, right? Which could be like, you know, could eviscerate that problem of violence, okay, then, but in today's world where our problems are global and interconnected, and with the challenges of governance perhaps even more acute, and the risks are more acute, and I think therefore, you know, revisiting the questions are, you know, couldn't be more timely. I mean, maybe it's always timely, and some of these questions are always timely, but you know, how to formulate processes which, you know, we can live with, which don't you know, emulate time and again those same violent and deeply unstable. I mean, that's the point. He's not just concerned with violence. It's that the violence doesn't achieve its own stated goal. It just preserves law. It's self-preserving. Does it ultimately reduce violence for us as, you know, as human beings? No. I mean, historically, there's no suggestion. So it's you know, so I think that, you know, they're pressing questions, aren't they? First of all, the processes for coming to a kind of a non-coercive decision making, and then a non-coercive way of taking our process forward. And I think you're right. I mean, ultimately, we talked about, you know, this idea of play, and, you know, politics is forever in the making, and maybe there is no other way than the practice of trying and failing. And yeah, but still learning from our, you know, our historical examples, of course, so important. But yeah, no, I mean, I agree. You know, I'm not a member of XR, but I can see that the growth of decision-making models that try to break with those parliamentary traditions is stuck within a form, because it then asks parliamentary democracies to instigate its decisions, and then you're back in your problem. And so I just think it's quite an acute lens to throw on perhaps what David has also been saying, and certainly what Benjamin and folk like Agamben have been trying to work out. Not, and rightly, there's no easy no easy ways out of that.
I would add something about kairos and time. There was an interesting note about the connection between Franz Rosenzweig, Stern der Losung, and Benjamin. Rosenzweig said there is a totally different idea of history between Christians and Jews, because Christians think of a linear history. The Messiah has already come, and he will come again at the end of the time. So they think of a line toward the end of the time, and the Messiah is external, and this has to do with messianism and with revolution. The utopia is something you will have, communism is something you will have in a future. Revolution is something that breaks the time in one point, and this point is to come. While, said Rosenzweig, since the Messiah has not come yet for Jews, it is we have to look inside ourselves to see it, and in a sense it's already there because it has not already come. And in my opinion, this relates to David's idea of looking at what's already there, at baseline communism that is in our everyday life, and also at myths and play that are in our everyday life. I was discussing the other day with Aisha about her. She wrote a wonderful and very passionate article about David and the Dawn, and she says that she points out the importance of the lack of fight and of myth in David's thought. But in my opinion, she didn't delve enough in the true concepts. Play, the role of play in the dawn of everything is very interesting. It's a place where people experiment different social arrangements, different ways of life, and even agriculture in the gardens of Adonis. Even play and myth are what is already there, what is being elaborated right now by all of us through imagination, through collective imagination. And this is something that is already there, and this is already also the revolution that is already there. So rather than making projects or plans that have to be implemented through laws and rules, we should or we could rather look at how to promote the alternatives that are already there, and then that can become stronger. At the end of the day, Paris Commune happened when nobody expected it, and when it looked like the sunburst of times where the right was rising in elections, like I see some communal experience with what's happening to Italy nowadays. So in my opinion, this is connected with what Nicholas was saying about experiments and about let's play, and an important part of playing, still David points out in Utopia of Rules, is setting rules. Children spend a lot of time discussing rules for their games, and discussing how to build their make-believe. And so maybe I'm confused, but this is random thoughts that are coming out from this amazing discussion.
I really like that, Simona. Thank you. I was just thinking again on this different conceptions of time, and just the two thoughts that jump again, my cloudy long time since I read him memory, but of course the difference in the Jewish tradition is at the moment the Messiah comes, time stops. So that's the kind of the one extremity, but in another, Benjamin describes this like when the Messiah comes, it'll just be a minor adjustment. And I love that. I love both that sort of perhaps the difficulty and then the smallness of the task ahead. And there's a humility there, no? Because in the end, like these are problems of the ages, and but it gives. So it doesn't deny the need for rupture, and I you know, to that I hold in whatever ways that, you know, manifests. But actually, sometimes those ruptural moments are, as you say, sometimes very unexpected, and they're like an adjustment where you just didn't think, like it's not some grand expository theory, but actually it's in people's experiments, and yeah, joy together. So thanks.
I just wanted to say I appreciate you bringing that up, that point about rules and play, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I'll just put this out there as something that I think is like I said, like I think a central kind of metaphysical framework that Graeber's working with, and I don't know if this is right, but this is what I think is going on. Is he's got these basic categories of play, games, and freedom, where freedom is actually a tension between playing by the rules and the ability to step outside of the rules, right? So freedom is this relationship of tension between these different kind of ideal poles. One of which, the play stuff, which is the creative exercise that doesn't even have any rules, and that's not freedom in itself. And he's saying it always ends up creating rules. This is what kids do, right? They're playing. It's boring if you just don't have any rules. Then you create rules and you get into them. And I wonder if that other side, right? So if the playing is end in itself activity without means, then maybe the rule thing is the other extreme, right? Is this means without ends. You're just like sucked into the utopia of rules or something. But again, for Graeber, there's always this third thing, which is the freedom to move back and forth, which is where we are. And any, you know, so within this framework, right? And for him, of course, this is happening at all different levels of being, right? Like down to the subatomic level, but at the human level, right? What we're doing, any different society, is a set of rules, written or unwritten, right? And then there's always also this relationship with the outside, which, you know, if we're talking about a king, right, that can be in the realm of sovereign power, the police and whatever, right? There's always the space in relation to the particular social game that has to have an outside, the ability to rewrite the rules because things change, whatever. There's all sorts of reasons. And partly the way I read it, as I was saying, right, is I think the question of building a free society, you know, is the question of how do we maintain an open system of human interaction that allows for the free engagement with the rules, getting sucked into those things, but also allows for the relationship with the outside to be something that's not just the privileged prerogative of a few people. And I also think, and this is what I kind of ended with in the paper in Lyon, is that there's if we have these different kind of ideal types of play, games, freedom is a relationship between these. I think Graeber is also talking about at a few different points in his work what a third pole of activity that sustains that freedom is, and I think he calls that love. That is the care for the freedoms of another, and that is another force that is neither just play, it is neither just rules, it is this other orientation that actually sustains relations of freedom at different levels.
I'm going to jump in right here if I can, because what Nicholas, you just said really reminded me of something, that what you said about love. This is speculative on my part, but one of the last things that David published, if I remember correctly, was a piece on hate. And he said that enough people that people weren't talking enough about hate. And, you know, he took some slack for it because people were saying, you know, why is he talking about hate? You know, this is, you know, all about care and freedom and love. And, you know, his point was, well, we can't have love in the absence of hate.
Yeah.
You know, love requires its opposite. And so the moment you mentioned love is you know, this important pillar, it made me then, because whenever I'm sort of thinking of these categories, I'm always kind of like reminding myself that David would say, okay, anytime you come up with a category, think of its anti-category or its structural inversion. And of course, the structural inversion for love is hate. And you know, I would have loved to have seen where he was going with that, because he was also working on this big book about war. And, you know, to me, you know, he understands them in such sophisticated ways that, you know, maybe they weren't connected, but, you know, it's just one of these things that I would have loved to have been able to hear more what he was thinking, because, you know, when he talks about when he talked about the war, he wasn't just meaning the constituent war between the people and the divine king. He was also kind of talking about the more, because that war has not ended. That war is going on. He was meaning more like war, you know, in the Clausewitz kind of way. And so, you know, if one were to think schizmogenetically, like war as a category, you know, kind of has this, I guess, charismatic, but maybe it's the opposite of the charismatic. It's almost the anti-charismatic, you know, but maybe there's something in hate that is outside of or separate from violence, because, you know, one is a category, the other is sort of, you know, action. And so I don't really have a question. I don't have a thought. It's just the moment I heard you say love, I immediately thought hate and thought, yeah, there's, you know, there's something there that is, I think, part of the discussion that you know, I think a lot of anarchists, Marxists shy away from, because we, you know, we don't want to have, you know, we don't want to acknowledge things that are unpleasant in some ways, because we're probably all utopianists at heart. So I really appreciate both speakers today. So let me just chime in my gratitude to both Lisa and Nicholas, and then especially Nicholas for the piece that you wrote in response to Nakamura. You were able to express criticism that I wasn't able to articulate it in words, and because I don't know Benjamin the way you do. So I thank you for providing that kind of language, because it's been very helpful for me, because I mean, that critique, I was like, well, you know, they're kind of guilty of imperial time. I see that, but like your way of explaining it, so valuable. So thank you.
I really appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, I had a lot of help trying to figure out a good way to narrow down an interpretation of Benjamin for that. And I spent a lot of time on it, but it was fun, frankly. And I'm yeah, thanks a lot. I'm glad that people are finding it useful. And yes, I love that, you know, the structural inversion of love, and that, yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound what I'm talking about, you know, when I invoke the category of love, like just flower-eyed, you know, about it, right? Like, and I think Graeber also, you know, is like, he's like made rhetorical choices, it seems, to not like dwell in the mourning and horror of all of the world, but I don't think he's covering over that at all. I think he just thinks we need to be cheerful about things in order to face how terrifying they all are, right? And yeah, there is this kind of structural inversion between these forms of domination, these forms of freedom, that to me reads like a systematic philosopher at work. And so that's what I'm like trying to kind of tease out and figure out, even though I know that he probably didn't want to be like read that way, but I think it's there, and so we should say it, you know. I'd love to hear from some other folks too. Like, anyone have general thoughts?
I've always got general thoughts, but that's not always helpful.
Or specific ones, then.
Okay, I'll go for a more mundane comment, which is after Nika's suggestion for watching the series Severance. That's an interesting one in terms of game space versus everyday life and the relationship that is expressed between sovereign power, administrative power, and the juxtaposition. And I think it would be a mistake to say that you should collapse those spaces into one space. The question is, what is the relationship between the two spaces? Because you are not one person in your life anyway. You're many different people. So what is the relationship between them? And that was something I picked up from Graeber in some other talk about rituals versus everyday life or whatever. Oh, and also thank you, Nika. It was great.
I guess while we're on films, I was just thinking about stuff I gave a paper a very long time ago on this, but I like of all of the documentary films in particular I've seen where I was like, oh, that's it. So that there's a bit in the text where he talks about, you know, how the death penalty kind of juts fearsomely as a sort of fateful, you know, exemplar, right, of the problem that, you know, perhaps sovereign and then legal, particularly the legal system and instituted system has. And it's Werner Herzog does a beautiful documentary on horrifying documentary on death row. Don't know if anybody has seen it, but like just as a slightly bleak but also extraordinary way of construing the problem through a documentary maker's eyes. It brings about, it kind of really raises all those absurdities, and because he follows families in the context of death row, you get this really awful. I've spent a long time reading about myth and tragedy and this sort of predestined order, and it's like the American version of holy crap. It basically is how it actually does manifest, this sort of almost like generational guilt played out because, you know, great-grandfather messed up and then the grandfather messes up and then the next kid ends up on death row, and it's just this like really horrifying but really, like, you know, visible way in which we actually do that, like aside from the structural stuff, it's like right there in real plain sight. And so I think it's a really interesting take on the problem in a way.
Okay, next 6 months to digest all of this. Thank you really very much. For me, it was my best reading group ever.
Ah,
And I learned so much tonight. So thank you very much. And I only one note. I was in at Lyon conference and also in Berlin at a conference about the donor, and that was how culture shouldn't be. This is how culture should be. We had time to discuss, delve, play, and really make value of our thoughts. And this is what academy cannot anymore do. And I think this is a great added value of a museum of care, because it's outside the academy that thought happens. So thank you, really, thank you very much.
oh, and thanks for me. What a pleasure. It's been ages since I did a reading group, and I'm a bit aside from the academy myself. It was such a generous, lovely space to be sharing. I'm really sorry I've missed preceding ones, but if you're doing anything more, please let me know. I'd love to chat with you all and read with you all, but really lovely to see you at least on screens.
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. And so 28, yeah, 28 and 29, we will have opening of David Graeber Institute. We will send the email. So,
29
and whoever
October.
in London or in UK, please come over because we will be offline. We have a plan.
Cool. Have fun.
October, not September.
Yeah.
October, yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
So,
Bye-bye.
see you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks everyone. Have a nice
everyone.
evening.
Yeah.
Lovely to meet you. Bye.